Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to introduce the ethical theory of deontology. However, before getting into that, I want to distinguish deontology from the other theories that you're reading. So all these theories fall under the umbrella of ethical objectivism, but that can be divided into theories that are consequentialist in nature versus those that are deontological. So the consequentialist theories that you're reading are utilitarianism and virtue ethics. You haven't read virtue ethics yet, but what you'll notice is that both of these theories consider what is right, what is morally right, to be in terms of the consequences of the action. Both also will think about consequences in terms of happiness. The difference will be in how they define happiness. So as we saw with utilitarianism, happiness is defined as utility or pleasure. So what produces the greatest happiness is the right thing to do. So an action is right depending on its consequences. The consequences determine if it's right. And what we're interested in terms of the consequences is, do they yield the greatest amount of pleasure, the greatest amount of happiness, the greatest amount of utility. On the other hand, we have the theory you're studying that is deontological. So this is Kantian ethics. You have here Immanuel Kant's life date, 1724 to 1804. Kant is, when he's writing his groundwork and his ethics, he is very much aware of utilitarian ideas, and he is arguing explicitly against them. He is arguing that there are actions that are right, period. And it doesn't matter what the consequences are. It doesn't even matter. The consequences could be bad, and the action would still be the right thing. So his ethics is not based on consequences, but rather duty. So that's what this deon refers to in deontology, is duty. So we have a duty as rational beings to perform certain kinds of actions, period. Or to will certain kinds of actions, period. Regardless of the consequences. Even if it makes you unhappy, even if it means you have less friends, there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong, period. Kant also provides, like the other thinkers that you're reading, a standard for how to determine if an action is right or wrong. So it's always helpful to keep that in mind. Like, what is the standard that they're giving me? So recall that for utilitarianism, the standard was the greatest happiness principle. When thinking about if an action is right, I tally up all the pleasures for everyone affected, every sentient being affected, and all the pains for every sentient being affected. And if the pleasures outweigh the pains, that is, if the action creates the greatest utility possible, then it's right. If the pleasures don't outweigh the pains, if the action doesn't create the greatest utility possible, it's not the right action. Kant gives us a different standard called the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative states that you should act only according to maxims. Another word for maxims is laws. That you can, at the same time, will that they be universal. So there's a few key terms here. So act only according to laws, that you can at the same time will that they be universal laws. So we'll just add the word laws in there at the end. So when thinking about an action, I have to do a little bit of work here. So I have to think, okay, I want to perform an action. What is that action as a law? So say, for example, I need to borrow money from a friend of mine. And I know that if I just say to them, hey, buddy, can I borrow $150? I'm never going to pay you back. I'm never going to do it. They're probably not going to give me the money. But if I say something to them like, could you loan me the $150? I promise I'll pay you back. They're more likely to give me the money, right? And so then thinking about this action, this I promise I'll pay you back, well, how would I state that as a law? So how do I put this action into the form of a law? And so as a law, this would be something like, it is okay to make false promises. Meaning, you promise something and you know you're not really going to keep the promise. So the question is, can this law be willed to be a universal law? Can I will that this law be universal? So I have to do a little bit of a thought experiment. I have to ask myself, can this law be, in other words, universalized? Is it universalizable? Can I magically snap my fingers and make it so that everyone, anywhere, anytime follows this law? Does it work as a universal law? Can it be universal? Or would it being universal make it defeat itself? Would making this law universal entail some kind of contradiction? Or is it possible? Can it actually be a universal law? And so when I ask myself, it is okay to make false promises, if I make this a universal law, does it work? Or does it defeat itself in some way? So this would mean that if every single time someone said to you or to anyone, including, you could think about all kinds of promises, like promises to banks, promises to landlords, any type of contractual agreement is a kind of a promise. Anytime someone says, I promise, if this was the case, it's okay to make false promises, then that means every time I say, I promise, it could be false. So what happens? What happens in the instance that if every time I say I promise, it could be false? What that means is that this phrase, I promise, comes to mean absolutely nothing. And not only does it come to mean absolutely nothing when other people use it, it also ends up meaning absolutely nothing when you use it. So the maxim is self-defeating, because when I ask myself, can it be universal? What happens is that this phrase, I promise, means nothing, which means when I say to my friend, I promise I'll pay you back, that also it means nothing when I say it. It's a little bit tricky, because what he's describing is not a consequence. He's not trying to talk about a consequence in which we have a real world in which people are telling lies, and then what does that look like? There's a plot of a movie about this, and I'm spacing on the name. I think The Invention of Lying, yeah. So he's not talking about this. He's not talking about like really consequences in the world. That's utilitarianism. What he's asking is, can the law work consistently, or does the law defeat itself in the execution of it, or in it, even willing it? Like, can it be a universal law or not? And in this case, the case of making a false promise, it can't be, because the law defeats itself, because my promise also won't be believed. And that was the whole point. That's the whole point of lying. Lying is based on a situation of exceptionalism. That is, my lie only works if everyone else is telling the truth. So think about that for a second. Lying is always based on a state of exceptionalism. That I'm the exception to the rule. I assume everyone else is telling the truth. Otherwise, my lie doesn't work. Because then we're in a situation where no one believes anyone, and lying doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean what it did. So what this standard doesn't allow, the categorical imperative doesn't allow, is it doesn't allow for exceptions. It doesn't allow for double standards. It doesn't allow me to say, well, it's okay for me to lie, but not you. Anything I want to do, it's a very strict standard. Anything I want to do, I have to think about, how do I put this as a law? And when I put this as a law, can this law be universal? And if the law can't be universal, meaning apply to everyone, then I can't do the action. So I can't make a false promise because I can't make that law universal. I can't will it to be universal, because in willing it to be universal, it defeats itself. So the thing I really want to emphasize about Kant's ethics so far is just this lack of ever being able to make oneself an exception, lack of having a double standard. Double standards bother us typically when they're used against us. So the example being something like someone lies on their resume and then they get really angry when they find out the job they were applying for was also not really the case, or that position or that promotion wasn't really available. So we tend to be okay with it when it benefits us, but not when it doesn't. But this standard is saying, no, there's no double standard. There's no exceptions. Anything you want to do, you have to think about, is this a law that I'd be willing to make universal, such that everyone abides by this law? Can this be a universal law? If it can be a universal law, that's the right thing to do. If it can't be, then no, it's not morally right. In the case of making a false promise, it's not possible to make it universal. But if you made the law something like, tell the truth, then that law can be universal. It's possible to make that law universal. I'm going to stop this video here and talk a little bit about the difference between a categorical versus a hypothetical imperative in the next video. I also would like to touch a bit on the other version of the categorical imperative.